continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.
I'm Alexander Hefner, your host on The Open Mind. Today we're honored to welcome back our own PBS chief, Paula Kerger, the distinguished president and CEO of the Public Broadcasting Service. Under Kerger's leadership, PBS has innovated amidst the disruptive media convergence of the modern era. Indeed, you may be watching this program or PBS's in-house productions on your web platform, smartphone, Apple TV, Amazon Fire, digital cable operator, or over the air with good old rabbit ears. It's noteworthy that these are principally for-profit entities, and I do want Kerger to weigh in, help us understand how PBS fits into a more expansive public communications landscape. Kerger has been a champion of PBS public affairs and its unique imperative as a network whose news division is not beholden to advertisers and the clickbait, ratings, and metrics that determine the nature of coverage elsewhere. And in this political season, when the press is criticized for a loop-to-loop reality show, a search for an entertainer-in-chief, that's partially our agenda today with Paula. PBS's distinctive mandate for free expression, the necessity of an autonomous information leader, and how to instill values of civility into our culture. And I welcome you, Paula, the longest-serving President and CEO of PBS.
It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be sitting in this chair again across from you this time.
Thank you. So that was a mouthful.
It was a mouthful. I'm exhausted listening to you.
But help us see PBS in this nonprofit public communications landscape, because when I speak to students around this country, I talk about PBS and wanting young people to realize that whether it's the browser you're on, Firefox, Mozilla, or the search engine you're using, or the encyclopedia, Wikipedia, this is a public communications network. Where does PBS fall into that?
Yeah. So, when we were founded, it was envisioned that there needed to be a place on the airwaves that was dedicated to education. In fact, many of our licenses, when they were granted for the express purpose of educational television. In fact, WNET, the E in those call letters, is significant. In fact, the legal name of the company is Educational Broadcasting Corporation. So, flash forward, and now we're awash in channels and opportunities. But the core of being able to use our ability to connect to the public using whatever media platform the public gravitates towards is still focused on that core principle of educational content, quality content. We hope what we do is entertaining, but we aspire to do something a little larger, which is to also create content that is educational, inspirational. And so that's the place that we continue to occupy. So as you put it in all of those words at the onset, it doesn't really matter whether you're watching broadcast television, which a lot of people still do, or watching through cable, or watching through satellite, or watching on an array of platforms. The significance is the content that we're delivering. We just want to meet people where they are, which is why we've been so interested in having our content available in all those different spaces.
And define your approach clearly as civic education.
Yes.
An outlier, but how do you make that the pervasive culture in which public affairs operates?
Well, I think that, look, we were created with the recognition that there was market failure, that there was a whole range of conversation that was not happening, particularly in the public affairs space, that public television could address. And so I think the key thing to understand is that we are, in fact, continuing to provide that service. And in fact, as you watch this election season, which you also referenced in your opening comment, where I think a lot of people have confused news and entertainment, we very clearly understand we're in the news business. We also understand the difference between news and point of view. And we look very carefully at trying to create the opportunities for discussion about the issues, not about the race as a race. We also are very focused on creating opportunities for conversation. I always say light, not heat. And I think that's the other thing that's missing, this ability to, we may have different opinions about an issue, but to be able to come together and have a conversation. We may not change the other's perspective, but at least understanding where people are coming from, I think, is the important piece of what our democracy is based on.
Do you think that we need to be more activist in demanding from our contemporaries that same responsibility of civic education on the airwaves?
Well, look, I think...
I say this in the climate of, and I wanted to ask you bluntly, are we in jeopardy of, someone said to me, if President Trump exists, it's going to be Trump on Channel 1, Trump on Channel 2, on Channel 13, on wherever your public station is. Are we in jeopardy of losing public service media? No,
I think the real question about our place and us versus all the commercial broadcasters, because I think that's the question you're asking. I was just at our annual meeting, and the great Newton Minow was recognized at that meeting. And of course, he's well known for a speech where he referred to television as a vast wasteland. The part of that speech that actually was the focus of the speech, which he thought was the more important message, was about the public service obligation of broadcasters. And so I don't want to speak for commercial broadcasters in terms of their own obligation. I can speak for us. And I believe very firmly that we have an obligation to try to help and inform citizenry in which our democracy is based. And you accomplish that by a relentless focus on facts and information and really creating the platform so that we can bring together various viewpoints and perspectives. And that's what we attempt to do each and every day in the work that we take up in the news, but also the work that we take up across our broadcast schedule, is to have the kinds of programs that enable people to make thoughtful decisions. And so I do think that when you look at public broadcasting and the role that we play, the one thing that I think people aren't always aware of is they think of their lovely public broadcasting stations in their communities. We're the 5th most watched of all broadcasters. So of the hundreds of channels, we're 5th most watched. And I think that we are in that position because people are looking for information and fact and civic discourse. And so if we continue to uphold that obligation, then I think we will have done a great deal in fulfilling our mission and our commitment and our compact with the American public.
And what about that fact-based future in what can be kind of a factless internet at times? How do you think we can deliver those same eyeballs on the web when clickbait is really the force that is governing what trends online?
Well, look, people watched 5.1 billion videos on PBS platforms last year. So I think that as we focus on ensuring that people understand how to evaluate the content they're seeing and to look for the authenticity of that, something that carries the PBS brand, I think is very important, because I think what we've tried to convey to the public, and clearly they understand, is that the same quality of the programs that we put on our air translates into what we put on the web. And so whether it is the programs that we're streaming on those platforms or whether it's new initiatives like PBS Digital Studios, which is our work in the YouTube space. There is a commitment to the integrity of that content that's important. We are very involved in the classroom. We always have been. So we have a very large audience of citizens under the age of 5, but we also have a lot of content that is used in classroom, and we spend effort not just in bringing the science programming and the histories and so forth, but also helping teachers navigate through media literacy. And I think that's a piece of what you're talking about with this whole swirl of information. If we can do a better job of making sure that people do understand how to evaluate the integrity and the authenticity and the truth in what they're reading, I think that's part of what a mission should be for a public broadcaster.
I think one of the areas in which that mission mobilizes young people is finding your roots. Mm-hmm. When you can actually take a swab of DNA as a young person and find your link in this great American canvas, this heritage that we share, I see that Gates documentary, and I wish every student could do that in his or her classroom.
One of the things that we have found with that series, which is really popular with a large viewing audience, but is particularly popular with young people, is both the DNA, but also helping kids think about the fact that they are part of history. And so history is not, this was the brilliance of Hamilton, by the way. It's not that history is sort of this dusty thing that you have to study in school and it has no relevance to our life, but we are all part of history. We all have our personal histories. And so the combination of looking at genealogy, as much as you're able to decipher that, as well as the DNA, which then links back further, really gives kids an opportunity to think very differently about their own place. And so we just, again, at our meeting last week, we had a class from Brooklyn that had come in that were very taken with not only the Finding Your Roots, but they were especially taken with Dr. Gates' series, African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, and found that documentary just really helped to open up their minds about our own history and really got them to question a lot of things that they're seeing in the news today. And so I think the more that we're able to help link kids to history through our video storytelling, whether it's documentaries like Many Rivers to Cross, or whether it's projects like Finding Your Roots, it's really a way to just bring history home and help people develop an appreciation for the fact that if you understand your past, you can help manage and navigate through our future.
That's the Twain idea, and embodied in what you said about Newt Minow, who's a mentor. He was on the show, both with my grandfather and me, as you are now, and spoke at length about the vast common good as opposed to the vast wasteland and the opportunity therein. When you were speaking to our contemporaries in Chicago, what insight did you most carry forward into this is how we have to construct this future of civic-oriented media?
So the meeting was an interesting one because I would almost put it into two pieces. So we had two individuals, both, by the way, who are 93 years old. One was Newt Minow and the other was Norman Lear, because we have a upcoming American Masters biography on Norman Lear. And both of them were certainly true pioneers in thinking about the potential of television, not just as a device for entertainment, but also to open up conversation about who we are. And so I think that certainly our colleagues in public broadcasting really understood very clearly that we all stand on the shoulders of giants. Your grandfather was another one. You know, these are people that in the early days of television really continued to push the envelope and look for that broader purpose. And we linked that to a real deep dive looking at issues around education and the growing inequality in this country and ways that public media can play a role in giving all people access to information, as well as the very specific role that we play in this whole civic discourse that we've been talking about. So I think that when you listen to someone like a Newton Minow talk about that public service obligation, and of course he was inspired and coined the phrase vast wasteland when there were 4 channels. And as he said to me once, it's gotten even vaster, this desert. But there are shining examples of really great work that happens in television, and not just on public television, by the way. I think we are in this really interesting period of great television, particularly in drama. You know, you see amazing drama that's being created on television, actually more so than in the motion picture industry. So it's not that we, as an industry, get it all wrong. I think we get a lot of stuff right. But I think there is a different obligation for the public broadcaster to continually look for ways to serve the public good in a deeper way than our commercial brethren.
As that wasteland becomes vaster, and it may be the vastest wasteland that we've ever seen as an American society or a civilization, you're not worried that if a more autocratic government took over, there would be a denial of the public imperative, the public airwaves, and that you and I and our jobs would be in jeopardy here?
Look, I think the thing that you have to remember about public television is that a few things. One is, and I think most people think we're like the networks. We're just the nonprofit version of the networks, and we're not. We were created, PBS, by stations. So we're the reverse of the network model. So across this country, there are 179 separate licensees that were created by the communities in which those stations operate. I spend a lot of time on the road. I visit a lot of stations and in communities where the public station is the last remaining locally owned and operated broadcaster in those communities. Communities treasure their public stations, and it's individual philanthropy in those communities that actually makes public television work. We get about 15%, that's 15% of our funding in aggregate from the federal government. That actually goes to our stations, not to me. And that really enables public broadcasting to be seen in communities that may not have the economic means to sustain it. States like Alaska, for example, where 50% of the funding to maintain that infrastructure comes from the federal government. But I think that when I talk about public broadcasting, it is that bond with the public and the trust the public places in us that has enabled us to be strong. And I think regardless of what happens in Washington, will continue to enable us to be a strong organization. If you look at our history, we've received bipartisan support over the years. Barry Goldwater was the person that made Sesame Street possible, and people are surprised when they hear that. So I think that there has been this, and I would argue we're the best public-private investment that the government has made.
So just for our viewers to understand, it is that independence of individual stations and the bonds that they have with local constituencies that you think is our firewall, in essence.
It is.
That would preclude any higher power, if you will, from usurping control.
It is, because that is how we're organized. And so I think that we are, people often talk to me about some of the great public broadcasters in other countries, like the BBC, for example, NHK in Japan. Those are largely funded by, taxes on television sets. It's a very different system. The fact is that while every year we have to make the case to the public that we are valued and worthy of support. And I think, there are millions of people around the country that support their public television stations, and that is, in fact, what makes us anchored in communities. It keeps us really honest, because if you violate that trust, people will no longer support you. So I think it does keep us very anchored, and it is, in fact, our strength. And I think it also is what makes us a uniquely American institution.
We had lunch, and you told me a story that was indicative of that tension between local and national, and the passion with which public broadcasters and their supporters feel around this should be focused on the community, this should be focused on national public affairs, this should be more activist in terms of the way that we're directing the coverage of news and information. Do you think fundamentally, though, there's a consensus that PBS ought to be the Wikipedia of the future, in essence, that foundation of knowledge that everyone ultimately finds to be instructive, informative, and the basis of education?
Yeah, I think that
Are we going to drive this to have because Wikipedia is among the most trafficked websites,
right,
third or fourth, and I think PBS.org can get there.
Yeah.
I really do, and I wonder if you share that sentiment.
Well, I think there are a couple questions that are embedded in what you've just asked. I mean, I think that what also defines us is the fact that collectively we create all this great national content. So all of our stations are, in fact, investors and owners in how that has been built. And so like any other organization that has national and local, we always have a lot of discussions of how do you weigh what is done absolutely local and what we do collectively. And we spend a lot of time really wrestling through, those questions. And the answer is an and, not an or. So, what we're always thinking about when we do something nationally is also, is there something that can spin off of that can also be done at the local level that drives more engagement and more conversation and more opportunity? I think the question about Wikipedia is an interesting one. Someone said to me once, I wonder if public broadcasting should have invented Wikipedia. And it's an interesting idea, because I think that so much of what we've attempted to do on an ongoing basis is informative content, but also when you consider the archive of all the material and everything that's been done. Think about the archive of just this show and all of the people that have appeared around this table with you and before that with your grandfather. It's great conversation. It is important conversation. And so figuring out how to look at all that material and make it accessible, in essence, like a Wikipedia, I think is a big and powerful idea. And we've begun to chip away at looking at how we can give people access to some of the material that does sit in shelves and in storage facilities of our stations across the country.
When I had Dan Cohen here, director of the Digital Public Library of America, and before that John Palfrey, who was his predecessor, there was a question about why there has not been a transformation of Wikipedia into the next phase that is video or visual based. And I think there's a lot of potential for PBS through the archives and the power of those to be that. I mean, because whether it's BuzzFeed or PBS, video is the future, and it has been.
Right, and that's why our audiences have grown, is because it's all people looking for video. And so I think the real challenge for us is to figure out both how to uncover the material and also how to organize it in a way that people can find what they're looking for. We have created that for the classroom. We've built something called Learning Media, of which we have all of these video and digitized assets that teachers can access. And the video is organized in small segments. And by the way, it's not just us. So in some ways, it's the idea that you're suggesting, this whole Wikipedia of knowledge. We work in partnership with Smithsonian and Library of Congress and National Archives, because I think for many organizations, they sit on a lot of content they know would be of use and value in the classroom, but they can't navigate that last mile so that they can make it easy for teachers to be able to find content and to lift it down. And so we've created that platform and that pipe in order to do that. And so I think that there is perhaps a bigger idea beyond what we're doing for the classroom where we can make more content available to the general public.
Let me ask you this to conclude, and I know this has gone by like a whirlwind. How do spectrum sales impact the digital divide to which you allude, and the concern that access to information over the air and digitally through these spectrum sales could be somehow compromised?
So right now we're in the midst of the auction, so we're in the quiet period, and I can't speculate. I don't have knowledge about who may or may not participate in the spectrum auction. What I am concerned about, and what I do know, I should say, is that at the end of the auction, we will look different. The broadcast landscape will look different for sure. There may be stations that are no longer on the air. And so I think that from my perspective, I worry a lot about making sure that over-the-air broadcast is robust and accessible. There are a lot of people, and one would argue people that need public broadcasting more than anyone else, that rely on over-the-air television, people that live in parts of the country where over-the-air television is the way to receive signal, and or that live in homes where the economics are such that cable is just a bill or a luxury that one can't afford. So I think that maintaining and making sure that over-the-air television coverage is there is really important. I sometimes feel like we live in this schizophrenic existence because we are very anchored in what has been the root way that people have received our content over the air. At the same time that we've made sure we're on all these other platforms so that we've created choice and convenience for people, that they can access content wherever they want to access it. And I want to make sure that when we get on the other side of this, we haven't created a deeper divide if in fact people are no longer able to access content that they once did over the air.
And are there strong schools of thought about whether or not stations should participate in the auction?
Well, I think that some stations have, I know, have explored the possibility of sharing some of their broadcast spectrum with others so that they can partially participate. So I think that every station has to evaluate the pros and cons of whether having more resources to do more locally weighed against having a little less capacity for over-the-air. They can't get completely out of the over-the-air business, or they're no longer a public station. And so I think that some balance of that. Where there is a real issue, though, is that some of our stations are owned by universities. And so if that station goes away and there is no public broadcaster, that is a problem.
May I just gently suggest to those PBS stations watching and to their viewers that the buyout, if you will, the payoff to the stations that are selling the spectrum, the revenue there be devoted to curbing the digital divide and ensuring that the resources are being devoted to ways to engage people via digital. That's the future.
Well, I think that most of the stations that are considering participating, obviously they are very focused on making sure they're reaching the public. The only part of this that gives me pause is, as I said, there are some parents that are not media organizations. They may be universities, they may be states, they may be other entities that may not have the same focus on providing media. And those are the places where I think we just have to watch and figure out how we can mitigate if in fact the reality comes that they're out of the television business.
But this is not a grave conversation. This is frankly an uplifting conversation.
Oh, I think this is a great time for public media. We have all this potential to reach people, and I think we're needed now more than ever.
Paula, a pleasure being with you today.
Great to be with you, Alexander.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at OpenMindTV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Rosalind P. Walter Foundation. With special thanks to the Schumann Media Center for additional support, and to the corporate community, Mutual of America.